The river and stream organisms we learned about in the last lecture are finely adapted to life in flowing water, as well as spatial and temporal variability in flow regimes. As we've discussed in past units, variability in flow creates habitats that are more or less suitable to specific species, and many organisms are also dependent upon seasonal, annual, and interannual changes in flow levels at different times in their life cycle. It's time to delve into these flow ecology relationships in more detail. First, I'd like to make a simple visual impression of what we're talking about. The graphic superimposed on the photo is a flow duration curve, and it indicates the percent of time over the course of a year that specific flow levels are exceeded. Note from the shape of the curve that the lowest flows are exceeded most of the year, while the highest flows are exceeded only for brief periods. The flow condition in the photo corresponds to dry season base flows. At this time, water is confined to the mineral stream bed. The flow is shallow, slow-moving, and the wetted width is minimal. There's not a lot of habitat available, but adapted species will have evolved coping mechanisms to survive the low flow periods. Higher flows during the wet season will inundate herbaceous vegetation beside the stream bed and provide new habitat for stream organisms to feed or hide. River flows will most likely also begin infiltrating into the river bank during this season, recharging groundwaters. During floods, the water moves up the river bank and inundates larger riparian vegetation, including trees. This may trigger ecological responses from the trees and may also rejuvenate geomorphological features in the channel needed by plants and animals at lower flow levels. The elephants in the photo illustrate the special ways in which terrestrial animals make use of river corridors for feeding, drinking, and other purposes like shelter from predators. Are you able to imagine the changes in your mind's eye? If not, consider this illustration of stream condition during wet season base flows and this illustration of stream conditions during floods. These larger floods occur infrequently and for short durations, but their influence is large. I'd like to organize this lecture around 4 guiding principles formulated by Stuart Bunn and Angela Arthington of Griffith University in Australia. They formulated the principles to illustrate how altering flow regimes affects aquatic biodiversity in streams and rivers, and thus they also illustrate the key relationships between flow and ecological processes. The curve on the slide shows the rise and fall of river discharge over a given period of time. The black line traces the long-term average, and the dashed lines reflect natural variability around that average. Principle 1 considers the importance of the range in high and low flows as a major determinant of range of physical habitats possible in streams and resultant biotic diversity and composition. Extremes of flow also determine the shape and size of rivers and their channels, the complexity of habitats, and disturbance regime. Principle 2 considers the many ways in which life histories of aquatic and riparian organisms are adapted to natural flow regimes. The timing, magnitude, frequency, and duration of a given flow influences growth strategies, and changes in flow often serve as cues for the beginning or end of stages in an organism's life history. Rates of flow changes also exert strong influences, especially with regard to necessary growth rates of aquatic plants and animals. Principle 3 considers the importance of flows to maintain lateral and longitudinal connectivity in river corridors. This is especially important for organisms that migrate during their life history, either upstream and downstream or onto adjacent floodplains. Inundation of riparian and floodplain vegetation also stimulates the exchanges of organic matter and its stored energy, as we discussed in the last lecture. Principle 4 considers that alterations in natural flow regimes often advantage invasive species, allowing them to outcompete native species that are disadvantaged by modified habitats, losses in connectivity, and disruptions to annual cycles of flow variability. Now let's have a closer look at these one by one. The variability of flow in magnitude, frequency, duration, and rate of change influences the substrates available to plant species and the level of disturbance species must be able to tolerate. The photo on the left is of the Giffre River in the French Alps. This is a mountain river with a high disturbance regime caused by rapidly changing flow levels and floods. As a consequence, the river is bordered by willow shrubs that are adapted to colonizing nutrient-poor, coarse-grained river bars and are capable of regenerating quickly following disturbance events. In contrast, in the more nutrient-rich and stable flow conditions of the Pacaya Samirio Reserve in the Peruvian Amazon, large mats of macrophytes develop on the margins of the river. These plants require more nutrient-rich, fine substrates. When floods do occur, these mats may be uprooted and washed downstream. Flow also strongly influences the availability of habitats for other primary producers. As we learned in the last lecture, the composition and distribution of primary producers in a system influence the community composition and structure of higher trophic levels. We learned that organisms show preferences for habitats defined by factors such as velocity, depth, and substrate grain sizes. The results presented in the bar graph show an example of this for two different mayfly species. The relative abundance of the two species is plotted on the y-axis as a function of flow velocity, which is plotted on the x-axis. Also plotted are abundances as a function of substrate grain size on the left and depth on the right. Different value ranges for these variables are indicated by the shading of the bars. Nesomeleatus shows a clear preference for lower velocities and larger substrate sizes, but no clear preference for depths. Deleatidium, in contrast, shows a slight preference for intermediate-sized substrate and no clear preferences for velocity or depth. It may therefore be considered to be a less sensitive species to changes in these variables, while Nesomeleatus is more sensitive. Fish occupy higher trophic levels, so in addition to responding to the availability of habitats for their own direct needs, their vitality is influenced by the availability of habitats for other species they depend upon. For example, trout require good stream cover to modulate temperature and provide litter for insects they feed upon. This requires meeting the flow requirements of habitats for riparian vegetation, which we considered in slide 5, and insects, which we considered in the last slide. Additionally, trout depend on the presence of large woody debris for hiding places and as habitat for insects and their food sources. At the time of spawning, trout need gravel and cobble-sized substrate where they can lay their eggs. This area must also have sufficient flow velocities to keep the water flowing over the eggs well oxygenated. Necessary velocities from a number of studies range from 0.2 to 0.5 meters per second. For migrating species, it's important to have sufficient water depths to move up or downstream. Moving to Principle 2, which focuses on the components of flow that influence the life history stages of species. For fish, spawning may be triggered by very different flow conditions, depending on the life history patterns of individual species. The Australian smelt, for example, spawns during stable low flows prior to summer floods. The Colorado pike minnow and yellowfish, by comparison, spawn following the peak flood flows, which generate the gravel bars where spawning fish converge and also send a cue to all fish in the river that the time for spawning has come. The yellowfish has also responded positively to artificial floods released from dams in the regulated Olifants River of South Africa as part of environmental flow releases. In each of these cases, as well as the case of trout and salmon, water temperature is an equally important variable in triggering spawning. Riparian cottonwood trees and willow shrubs in the San Joaquin River Valley of California synchronize the release of their seeds with the annual summer floods. As the figure shows, seed release peaks in the weeks following the floods, when freshly created sandbars are exposed and moisture is abundant. This process is especially sensitive in the case of cottonwoods, which require a combination of conditions that occur only once every 5 years or so. When substrate and moisture conditions are right, newly dropped cottonwood seeds will germinate within 24 hours, but root growth is slow, so the substrate must remain moist for 1 to 3 weeks after germination for the seedlings to establish themselves. Young trees remain susceptible to droughts if groundwater drops below their rooting depths. Principle 3 addresses the importance of flow influences on the longitudinal and lateral connectivity of river systems. Beginning with longitudinal connectivity, there are many remarkable examples of long-distance migrations by fish. The most well-known of these is certainly the migration of salmon from the sea into rivers around the world. In the Amazon River system, a large number of catfish migrate over great distances, some more than 4,000 kilometers. These catfish migrate from the Amazon estuary, shown in yellow on the map, which is their nursery region, to the foothills of the Andes where they spawn. This migration occurs over the course of years, and larval fish are then washed back to the estuary over the course of weeks. Many other types of fish migrate between river channels and floodplains as part of their life history. The regular onset of floods greatly expands the availability of habitats, offering abundant resources and protective cover for larval and juvenile fish. The image on the slide shows the interconnected channels, flooded forests, and floodplain lakes of the central Amazon basin of Brazil. This is an extraordinary system with the inundation of more than 250,000 square kilometers of floodplain forest each year. One species that takes advantage of this newly created habitat is the tambaqui, a fish that spawns in the river channel on woody shores or grassy levees, but requires a high level of lateral connectivity to access all of the habitats and resources required to complete its life history. It's primarily a fruit-eating fish, dining on a wide variety of fruits that fall from floodplain trees. Principle 4 propels us clearly into the topic of altered flow regimes that compromise native species and favor exotic species. As we've seen in the lecture so far, native species are adapted to the natural variability of their home rivers, including natural disturbance regimes. This gives them advantages over exotic species looking for any opportunity to invade. But when flow regimes are modified, these advantages are lost or diminished. An instructive example is the case of tamarisk in the Colorado River Basin of the USA. Tamarisk is an exotic species that has invaded much of the Colorado River since it was regulated, and the regular annual flooding regime was lost. The dense thickets of tamarisk have established themselves on the banks of river, which before had been regularly scoured by floods now captured behind large dams. These thickets prevent the establishment of native vegetation and alter many other natural processes in the river system. Tamarisk also consume large quantities of water, which reduces water availability to water-stressed downstream areas. There have been limited experimental releases of floods from large reservoirs to destroy the tamarisk and restore other ecological processes, but the larger program to control tamarisk involves the introduction of the tamarisk leaf beetle from Eurasia, which feeds on the plant. The beetle is now spreading rapidly. We've mostly considered the flow ecology relationships of individual species in this lecture, but they of course all rely on the same river, and when the flow ecology relationships of the full riverine community are considered, it can become quite complicated. This figure from the Susquehanna River Basin in the USA provides a detailed illustration of the linkages between seasonal flow variability and ecological functions in the river. High flow events are light blue in color and are shown to cue fish migrations in the fall, to scour ice and maintain floodplain connectivity in the winter, to maintain channel morphology during very high spring flows, and to transport organic matter, promote vegetation growth, and maintain water quality in the summer. Functions of seasonal flows, which are in orange, and low flows, which are in red, can be explored by reading the text associated with the colored bullet points. You'll need to pause the video to read this slide in detail, and the report describing it is one of your required readings for the unit. So we've arrived at the take-home messages for this lecture. First, we've learned that river and stream organisms are finely adapted to life in flowing water, as well as spatial and temporal variability in flow regimes. We've learned that spatial variability in flow creates habitats that are more or less suitable to specific species. Seasonal, annual, and interannual changes in flow levels create needed habitats at different times in the life cycles of many species and provide connectivity between habitats. We've learned that the preservation of multiple components of a river flow regime is necessary to maintain ecological function and deter invasions of exotic species. Now, in the next lecture, we'll begin looking at the methods designed to do exactly this. That's the end of this lecture. Thanks very much.